What if the place you grew up in was already dying, and no one told you? What if, beneath quiet streets, church bells, and schoolyards, something ancient and unstoppable had already been ignited, slowly turning your hometown into a ticking environmental time bomb? Centralia, Pennsylvania, was once just another small American mining town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where routines never changed, and where danger felt very far away. And that is exactly why the tragedy began, unnoticed. For most of the 20th century, Centralia lived by a simple rhythm. Coal mines powered the town's economy, fed families, paid mortgages, and shaped identities. Generations worked underground, extracting anthracite coal from the earth, believing this resource was both a blessing and a guarantee of stability. Houses lined quiet streets. Children walked to school. Sunday services filled the churches. Nothing about Centralia suggested it was on the edge of becoming one of the most toxic, abandoned towns in American history. But disasters rarely announce themselves with alarms. They arrive disguised as routine. In the early 1960s, Centralia was already showing subtle signs of decline. Coal demand was falling. Mines were closing. Younger residents were leaving in search of work elsewhere. The town was shrinking, but slowly, naturally, the way many rural American towns did. There was no panic, no urgency, just adaptation. And then came a decision so small it barely registered at the time. In 1962, city officials authorized what they believed was a simple cleanup effort. An open landfill near the town's cemetery was used as a dumping site, and, as was common practice in many mining towns, they decided to burn the trash to reduce waste. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't reckless by the standards of the time. Similar fires had been lit before, extinguished before, and forgotten just as easily. No one gathered to debate it. No one imagined consequences. But beneath Centralia lay something no fire should ever meet. Below the landfill was an extensive network of abandoned coal mine tunnels, some poorly mapped, some forgotten entirely. When the fire was lit, flames slipped through cracks in the ground and reached exposed coal seams. And coal does not behave like ordinary fuel. Once ignited underground, it can burn slowly, silently, and almost endlessly, fed by oxygen seeping through fractured rock. At first, nothing dramatic happened. There was no explosion, no visible catastrophe. Just a fire that didn't quite go out. Days passed, then weeks. Attempts were made to extinguish it. Firefighters poured water into the pit. Dirt was pushed over the burning area. It seemed under control. But underground, the fire had already escaped containment. It began moving laterally, quietly, patiently, spreading through coal veins like a living thing finding new paths. The town above went on with life, unaware that beneath their feet, temperatures were rising to hundreds of degrees. Carbon monoxide began accumulating underground. Ground stability slowly weakened. But these processes were invisible, and invisible threats are the easiest to ignore. Centralia was not reckless. It was trusting. It trusted experience, tradition, and the belief that problems, once addressed, stayed solved. This trust would prove fatal to the town's future. By the mid-1960s, subtle changes began to surface. Snow melted faster in certain areas. The ground felt warmer in places. It shouldn't. Occasional wisps of smoke rose from cracks near the landfill. These signs were easy to rationalize. Old mines often produced strange effects. Residents had lived around them for decades. This was mining country. Anomalies were normal. And yet, beneath this normalization, something unprecedented was unfolding. An underground coal fire is not a house fire. It does not consume itself quickly. It migrates. It adapts. It can burn for decades, even centuries, if fuel remains. Centralia had unknowingly given birth to a disaster that could not be outrun by time or simple solutions. What makes this story especially tragic is not just the fire itself, but the mindset that surrounded it. Centralia was built on coal. Coal fed the town, employed it, and defined it. The idea that coal could now be the agent of its destruction was almost unthinkable. Accepting that reality meant accepting that the town's foundation had turned hostile. And so, in these early years, the fire remained a background problem. Something officials believed they could still manage, something that did not yet demand radical action. Life continued above ground, while the earth below grew hotter, more unstable, and more dangerous by the month. This is how Centralia's tragedy truly began. Not with panic, not with chaos, but with routine, confidence, and delay. A town that trusted what it knew, unaware that what it knew no longer applied. And as the fire continued to spread silently beneath homes, schools, and streets, the real danger was not just the flames underground. It was how long it would take for anyone to realize that Centralia was already lost. If this story already feels unsettling, it's because what happened in Centralia could happen anywhere people trust routine more than warning signs. Take a moment to reflect on what you've just heard. Do you think this disaster was truly an accident, or the result of small decisions ignored for too long? Leave a comment sharing your first reaction or your initial theory about Centralia. Reading different perspectives helps uncover details that often go unnoticed. If this kind of deep, investigative storytelling matters to you, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It's how you tell the algorithm that these stories deserve to be told. The decision that doomed Centralia did not come from greed, corruption, or malice. It came from habit, and that is what makes it so dangerous. In towns built around industry, especially mining towns, danger becomes familiar. Risk blends into routine. When you live surrounded by abandoned shafts, unstable ground, and underground heat, your sense of what is normal slowly shifts. Centralia was no exception. The landfill fire authorized in 1962 was not a rogue act. It followed a pattern. For years, the town used an open pit near the cemetery as a dumping site. Trash accumulated. Periodically, it was burned to reduce volume. This was not unique to Centralia. Similar practices existed across coal regions in Pennsylvania and beyond. Fires were lit, monitored, and usually extinguished within days. The assumption was simple: fire was controllable. What no one fully accounted for was how deeply interconnected Centralia's underground world truly was. Beneath the surface lay miles of abandoned coal tunnels, some dating back decades, carved without modern planning or comprehensive mapping. Records were incomplete. Some mines had been sealed improperly. Others were forgotten entirely. To the people above ground, these tunnels were out of sight and out of mind. To fire, they were highways. When flames slipped into the coal seam, the behavior of the fire changed instantly. Unlike surface trash fires, underground coal fires do not need open flames to survive. They smolder. They creep. They follow veins of fuel, sometimes advancing only a few feet per year, sometimes accelerating unexpectedly when oxygen becomes available. Extinguishing them requires aggressive, expensive, and immediate action. Action Centralia was neither prepared for nor psychologically ready to take. Early firefighting efforts focused on surface solutions. Water was poured into the landfill. Soil was pushed over burning areas. These methods work for conventional fires, but underground coal burns differently. Water evaporates before reaching the combustion zone. Dirt caps crack and leak oxygen. Each attempt gave the illusion of control while the fire continued, spreading unseen. By the time state and federal agencies became involved, the fire had already moved beyond the original landfill. It was no longer a single point of ignition. It was a migrating system, a living network of combustion expanding beneath streets, homes, and public buildings. Here is where the story becomes more unsettling. Experts warned early on that drastic measures were required. Proposals included digging massive trenches to isolate the fire, flooding entire mine sections, or removing large quantities of burning coal. These solutions were technically possible, but financially overwhelming. Estimates climbed quickly into the millions. For a shrinking town with limited tax revenue, the numbers felt unreal. So officials hesitated. Instead of decisive action, they chose containment strategies, monitoring, partial barriers, temporary fixes. Each delay allowed the fire to strengthen its hold underground. Each year that passed reduced the chances of stopping it completely. What could have been a short-term crisis became a long-term catastrophe through incremental inaction. Residents, meanwhile, were caught in an informational fog. There were no dramatic announcements, no evacuation orders, just reassurances that the situation was being handled. Life continued. Children played outside. Families slept above ground that was slowly hollowing out. This is a pattern seen repeatedly in environmental disasters. The danger grows gradually, invisibly, while authorities struggle between acknowledging reality and avoiding panic. Admitting the truth too early risks political backlash. Admitting it too late risks human lives. Centralia drifted into that dangerous middle ground. By the late 1960s, the fire was no longer a question of if, but how far. It had slipped beyond initial containment zones and was now traveling through coal seams beneath residential areas. Yet even then, the town clung to the hope that it could be managed, slowed, or outlasted. What makes this phase of the story especially tragic is that Centralia was not ignorant. It was cautious to a fault. Each decision was made to avoid disruption, to protect normalcy, to delay the unthinkable. But disasters do not negotiate. They do not wait for budgets or public consensus. Underground, temperatures continued rising. Gases accumulated. The ground grew unstable. The fire had time, and time was on its side. Centralia's fate was not sealed by one mistake, but by a series of reasonable choices made in an unreasonable situation. And once that line was crossed, once the fire spread beyond control, there was no clean way back. As the years passed, the cost of stopping the fire multiplied, and soon the question would no longer be how to save Centralia, but whether it could be saved at all. Before we continue, leave a comment sharing what you think was the turning point: the original fire, the delayed response, or the decision to prioritize normalcy over urgency. By the time officials realized the fire was no longer contained, Centralia was already living above something that behaved less like an accident and more like a buried organism. Underground coal fires do not roar. They do not glow dramatically. They breathe. They consume slowly, methodically, drawing oxygen through fractures in the earth and releasing heat and gas in return. And that is what made Centralia's enemy so difficult to confront. It could not be seen, only felt. Below the town, temperatures in the coal seams climbed steadily, in some places exceeding several hundred degrees Fahrenheit. The fire advanced through interconnected veins of anthracite, following paths carved decades earlier by miners who never imagined those tunnels would one day become conduits for destruction. Unlike surface fires, this one had no clear edges. It moved unpredictably, sometimes stalling, sometimes accelerating, depending on geology, airflow, and pressure. Above ground, the town began to notice changes that defied explanation. In winter, snow melted in strange patterns. Some patches of ground stayed warm long after frost settled everywhere else. Residents walking their usual routes felt heat rising through the soles of their shoes. Basements grew uncomfortably warm. In certain areas, the earth seemed to exhale, thin wisps of steam curling upward from cracks in roads, yards, and sidewalks. At first, these signs were dismissed as quirks of mining country. Centralia had always lived with the earth shifting beneath it. Subsidence, sinkholes, and mine-related anomalies were part of life. But this was different. The changes were spreading, not isolated, and they were becoming more aggressive. Carbon monoxide began seeping upward. This gas is colorless, odorless, and deadly. Underground, it accumulated as coal smoldered without enough oxygen to burn cleanly. Above ground, it found its way into homes through foundations, basements, and crawl spaces. Carbon monoxide does not announce itself. It dulls senses, causes headaches, dizziness, nausea. Symptoms easily confused with flu, fatigue, or stress. For years, residents reported unexplained illness. Pets grew lethargic. Birds avoided certain areas. Some people complained of constant headaches and dizziness that vanished when they left town. No single event tied these symptoms together, until monitoring equipment began telling a different story. Tests revealed dangerously high carbon monoxide levels in multiple locations. In some homes, concentrations reached thresholds that could cause unconsciousness or death within minutes. The danger was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. But measurement did not equal resolution. Officials installed vents, drilled boreholes, and tried to redirect gases away from populated areas. These efforts treated symptoms, not the disease. Venting relieved pressure temporarily, but also fed the fire by introducing fresh oxygen underground. Every intervention carried risk. Every solution seemed to create a new problem, and still the fire advanced. As coal burned away, the ground above weakened. Voids expanded. Support pillars collapsed. The risk of sudden sinkholes increased. In some places, the earth dropped inches at a time. In others, it waited, storing collapse for a moment that could come without warning. Residents began to fear what they could not see. Parents worried about children playing outside. Homeowners questioned whether their houses rested on solid ground or empty space. The town's geography itself became unreliable. Perhaps the most disturbing realization was this. The fire was not just under Centralia, it was becoming Centralia. It followed beneath streets, schools, and churches. It crept toward residential blocks. Mapping efforts revealed the fire's footprint expanding year after year. What had started near a landfill now threatened the heart of the town. Yet stopping it required actions so extreme they bordered on unimaginable. Entire sections of land would need to be excavated, massive trenches dug through neighborhoods, infrastructure destroyed to save what little remained. The cost soared into tens of millions of dollars, money that no local government, and eventually no state agency, was willing to commit. Time, again, became the fire's greatest ally. The longer Centralia waited, the more entrenched the fire became. Coal seams extended miles beyond town limits. Even if one section were isolated, others could reignite it. Some experts warned that the fire could burn for a century or more. Others estimated hundreds of years. That meant something unthinkable. The land beneath Centralia might never be safe again within any human lifetime. As this reality set in, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about extinguishing the fire. It was about survival, about risk tolerance, about how long a town could exist on top of a slow-burning inferno before the cost outweighed the idea of staying. Centralia's residents were now living in a place where the ground itself could betray them at any moment, where the air could turn toxic without warning, where the future was no longer a plan, but a question mark shaped like smoke rising from the earth. If you've ever wondered how far danger can spread before it forces action, Centralia offers a chilling answer. The most unsettling part of Centralia's story is not the fire itself, but how long it took for its warnings to be taken seriously. Long before evacuation orders, before official declarations of danger, the town was sending signals, quiet, fragmented, easy to dismiss if you didn't want to see the whole picture. The first warnings didn't come from scientists or government agencies. They came from the ground. Cracks began appearing in streets and sidewalks where none had existed before. At first, they were thin, hairline fractures, the kind people blamed on winter freeze and thaw cycles. Pennsylvania towns were used to that. But these cracks didn't behave normally. They widened faster than expected. Some emitted faint heat. Others released thin streams of smoke that curled upward and vanished into the air as if nothing were wrong. Residents noticed unusual smells. Not smoke in the traditional sense, but something sharper, metallic, almost chemical. It drifted through basements and crawl spaces. People opened windows. They blamed old pipes, mold, bad air circulation. Again, nothing dramatic enough to demand immediate action. Children walking to school reported warm patches in the pavement. Snow melted in winding paths that traced invisible lines through neighborhoods. Dogs refused to cross certain areas. Birds avoided rooftops where heat rose constantly from below. These details were shared casually, as anecdotes, not alarms. What made the situation more dangerous was familiarity. Centralia was a mining town. People were conditioned to live with abnormal ground conditions. Small cave-ins, mine subsidence, and unstable soil were part of local history. That collective experience dulled the sense of urgency. When everything has always been a little dangerous, it becomes harder to recognize when danger has crossed a line. Officials responded in pieces. Monitoring equipment was installed in selected locations. Gas levels were checked intermittently. Reports were written, filed, and discussed in meetings far removed from the streets where families lived. The language of those reports was cautious, technical, and non-committal. Elevated readings, potential risks, continued observation recommended. There was no single moment when someone stood up and said, "This town is no longer safe." Instead, there was drift. One of the most chilling incidents occurred in 1981, nearly 2 decades after the fire began. A 12-year-old boy fell into a sinkhole that opened suddenly beneath his feet. The hole was several feet wide and dropped into a steaming void filled with carbon monoxide. He was pulled out just in time by a relative. Had he fallen seconds later, or alone, he would have died. This should have been the undeniable turning point. A visible, nearly fatal event. Proof that the danger was no longer abstract. And yet, even then, action came slowly. The sinkhole was sealed. The area was fenced. Investigations followed. But the broader reality remained difficult to accept. Acknowledging that Centralia itself was unsafe meant confronting a cascade of consequences: relocation, loss of property, destruction of a community's identity. For many officials, delaying that conversation felt easier than starting it. Meanwhile, residents lived in uncertainty. Parents wondered whether their homes were safe to sleep in. Elderly residents questioned whether moving was even possible. Property values collapsed quietly. Houses became impossible to sell. Insurance coverage grew complicated. Banks hesitated to issue loans. The town's economic collapse accelerated in silence. What made everything worse was inconsistency. Some parts of Centralia appeared relatively stable. Others were clearly compromised. This uneven danger created false reassurance. People told themselves the fire was over there, not under their street. They adjusted routines, avoided certain areas, adapted instead of escaping. This psychological adaptation is common in slow-moving disasters. Humans are wired to respond to sudden threats, explosions, floods, visible destruction. But gradual danger invites normalization. Each new warning feels only slightly worse than the last, never enough to trigger flight. Government agencies were also divided. Local authorities lacked funding. State agencies disagreed on responsibility. Federal involvement came with bureaucracy and political risk. No one wanted to be the one to declare a town uninhabitable. Because once that declaration is made, there is no going back. So the warnings accumulated without resolution. Cracks widened. Gas readings spiked and fell. Heat maps showed expansion. Reports grew thicker. And still, families lived above ground that could open without warning. Centralia existed in a suspended state, not officially doomed, but no longer truly alive. The ignored warnings weren't just geological. They were social. emotional, economic. A town trapped between denial and displacement, waiting for a decision that would redefine everything. And eventually that decision would come. Not because the fire stopped, but because pretending it could be managed became more dangerous than admitting the truth. At a certain point, Centralia stopped feeling like a town and began feeling like a warning sign. The ground no longer just cracked, it exhaled. The air itself became hostile, turning ordinary spaces into invisible hazard zones where danger had no smell, no color, no clear boundary. This was the phase when Centralia's disaster became impossible to separate from daily life, because the environment itself was now actively poisoning the people who remained. Carbon monoxide was no longer an abstract risk discussed in reports. It became a presence. The gas seeped upward through soil, foundations, and abandoned mine shafts, collecting in basements, crawl spaces, and enclosed rooms. Carbon monoxide is especially cruel because it deceives the body. It does not burn the lungs or irritate the eyes. Instead, it replaces oxygen in the bloodstream, slowly starving the brain while leaving the victim unaware. Headaches, confusion, fatigue, nausea. Symptoms easy to dismiss, especially in a struggling town where stress and exhaustion were already common. Residents began reporting a pattern. They felt sick at home, better when they left town. Children complained of dizziness at school. Pets collapsed without warning. Birds avoided rooftops where warm air rose constantly from below. These were not isolated anecdotes anymore. They were environmental signals, repeated across households. In response, authorities installed carbon monoxide detectors throughout Centralia. Some of them triggered alarms daily. Others spiked suddenly, then returned to normal, creating a false sense of safety. This fluctuation was one of the fire's most dangerous traits. It did not poison the town evenly. It surged, retreated, and surged again, depending on underground airflow, pressure changes, and weather. This unpredictability meant no one could ever say with confidence that a home was safe. The landscape itself began to warp. Steam rose from fissures in roads and vacant lots, carrying toxic gases into the open air. In winter, these vents created surreal scenes, snowless streaks cutting through white fields as if the earth were bleeding heat. Asphalt softened, pavement buckled. Vegetation died in irregular patterns where roots overheated underground. Entire blocks developed an eerie stillness. Windows stayed closed year-round. Yards went untended. People learned to avoid certain sidewalks, instinctively, without being able to explain why. Centralia became a place navigated by intuition and fear rather than maps. The most disturbing realization was that there was no reliable defense. Ventilation systems helped temporarily, but often worsened the problem by feeding oxygen to the underground fire. Ceiling cracks trapped gases elsewhere, forcing them to emerge in new locations. Each fix merely displaced the danger. The town was not being cured. It was being reshaped by a toxic process no one could fully control. Medical professionals grew increasingly concerned. Long-term exposure to low levels of carbon monoxide can cause cognitive impairment, heart stress, and neurological damage. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Yet proving direct causation was difficult. There was no single mass poisoning event, no clear legal threshold that forced immediate evacuation. This ambiguity delayed decisive action and deepened suffering. As the environment deteriorated, social bonds began to fracture. Some families left quietly, abandoning homes they could no longer sell. Others stayed, clinging to the belief that the danger was exaggerated or localized. Arguments divided neighbors, trust eroded, in officials, in experts, even in one another. Centralia was no longer just toxic in a chemical sense. It was toxic socially. Living in constant low-level danger reshaped behavior. People slept lightly, parents worried obsessively, elders refused to leave familiar ground even as their health declined. Every decision carried weight: stay, and risk slow poisoning, or leave and lose everything that made life recognizable. The fire beneath Centralia did more than burn coal. It burned certainty. It burned community. It burned the illusion that home is always a place of safety. By this stage, the question was no longer whether Centralia could survive as a town. It was whether allowing people to remain was itself an act of negligence. For the families who remained in Centralia, the most unbearable part of the disaster was not the fire itself, but the knowledge that their children were growing up on top of it. A slow-moving environmental catastrophe is terrifying for adults, but for children, it creates something far more unsettling: danger without language. They could feel it, sense it, live inside it, long before they could understand it. Schools were among the first institutions forced to confront reality. Teachers noticed students complaining of headaches, dizziness, and nausea during the day. Some children appeared unusually tired, unfocused, or irritable. Attendance dropped as parents kept kids home, just in case. School buildings, like homes, sat on ground riddled with mine tunnels. Carbon monoxide detectors were installed, alarms tested, evacuation drills rehearsed, not for fires above ground, but for poison rising from below. Imagine being a child learning multiplication while knowing that the floor beneath your desk might not be solid. Playgrounds became zones of anxiety. Parents watched closely as kids ran, terrified that the ground might suddenly open. Certain areas were quietly declared off-limits, though often without official signage. Children learned the rules informally. Don't play there. Don't step there. Don't ask too many questions. Fear became part of the landscape. Homes were no refuge. Families slept with windows cracked open even in winter, desperate for airflow. Some ran fans constantly to push air out of basements. Carbon monoxide alarms became background noise, sometimes ignored because they sounded too often, sometimes feared because silence felt worse. Parents lay awake at night listening for beeps, for creaks, for signs they couldn't name. For children, this environment rewired what normal meant. They grew up thinking it was ordinary for streets to steam, for ground to be warm, for entire blocks to be abandoned. Birthday parties happened in shrinking circles. Friends moved away suddenly, sometimes without goodbye. Houses emptied, classrooms thinned. The town didn't collapse all at once. It hollowed out, leaving gaps where life used to be. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Uncertainty became constant. Should they plan for the future here? Should they dream of staying or leaving? Adults struggled to answer, and children absorbed that uncertainty without context. Studies of communities facing slow environmental disasters show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and long-term stress, especially among young people. Centralia fit that pattern perfectly. Parents faced impossible choices. Leaving meant abandoning property that had become nearly worthless. Homes passed down through generations could not be sold. Insurance disputes dragged on. Financial ruin loomed. Staying meant risking children's health, possibly their lives. There was no option that didn't involve loss. Some families split. One parent stayed to work while the other took children elsewhere. Others delayed the decision year after year, hoping for clarity that never came. Each passing year increased the emotional cost of leaving, even as the physical danger worsened. Meanwhile, officials debated policy, budgets, and liability. For residents, those conversations felt distant and abstract. What mattered was immediate, intimate, and terrifying. Could they safely raise their children here? Centralia became a place where childhood was shaped by evacuation, plans, warning signs, and the constant sense that home was temporary. Where the future felt conditional, always dependent on gas readings and geological reports. The fire beneath the town did not just threaten buildings, it threatened generations. And as more families quietly left to protect their children, the town crossed another invisible line, from a struggling community to one that could no longer sustain itself. There comes a moment in every long-running disaster when denial finally collapses under the weight of evidence. For Centralia, that moment did not arrive with a single explosion or mass casualty event. It arrived quietly, through paperwork, risk assessments, and a brutal conclusion no one wanted to voice out loud. This town was no longer safe to exist. By the early 1980s, the situation had crossed a threshold. The underground fire had expanded well beyond its original boundaries. Carbon monoxide levels were spiking unpredictably. Ground subsidence was accelerating. The 1981 Sinkhole incident involving the young boy had shaken officials deeply, even if they were reluctant to admit it publicly. What had once been a manageable problem had become a liability measured in human lives. For the first time, government language began to change. Reports no longer spoke only of monitoring and mitigation. They began to include phrases like unacceptable risk and threat to public safety. Federal agencies were pulled in more aggressively. Engineers and geologists delivered assessments that were no longer cautiously optimistic. The conclusion was stark. The fire could not be extinguished with available resources, and the land above it could not be made reliably safe. Centralia was officially labeled hazardous. This designation changed everything. Once a place is declared unsafe for habitation, responsibility shifts. The question is no longer how to fix the problem, but how to protect people from it. And protection, in this case, meant something unthinkable to many residents: leaving. In 1984, the U.S. government approved a voluntary relocation program for Centralia's residents. Millions of dollars were allocated to buy out homes, compensate families, and help them move elsewhere. On paper, it sounded like a solution. In reality, it was the beginning of the town's emotional collapse. Voluntary meant choice, and choice meant conflict. Some residents accepted the buyouts immediately. They had waited years for an escape that didn't feel like total financial ruin. Others refused. This was their home. Their parents were buried here. Their lives were built here. No amount of money could replace that. To them, leaving felt like surrender, like admitting the fire had won. The town fractured. For sale signs appeared next to houses still occupied. Entire streets emptied while a few homes stubbornly remained. Utilities were shut off block by block as population declined. Schools closed due to low enrollment. Churches lost. Congregations, the social infrastructure that defines a town, collapsed faster than the physical one. As more people left, staying became even more dangerous. Emergency response times increased as services withdrew. Roads deteriorated without maintenance. Streetlights went dark. The remaining residents lived among vacant homes and overgrown lots, surrounded by silence and smoke vents rising from the ground. Centralia no longer felt abandoned. It felt erased. The government's position hardened. Over time, voluntary relocation became pressure. Pressure became enforcement. In the 1990s and early 2000s, eminent domain proceedings were initiated to claim remaining properties. Some residents fought in court. A few won temporary reprieves. Most did not. By 2002, nearly all of Centralia's properties had been condemned. Addresses were removed from maps. Zip codes were revoked. Centralia was no longer recognized as a functioning municipality. A town that once held over 1,000 residents was reduced to a handful of holdouts. What makes this moment especially haunting is that Centralia did not die because it was forgotten. It died because it was acknowledged too late. The danger was real, documented, and undeniable. But recognition came only after decades of delay. The official verdict was final. Centralia could not be saved. Not because the fire burned too fiercely, but because it burned too long. Time transformed a solvable crisis into an irreversible one. And once that line was crossed, there was no version of Centralia that could continue safely. Yet even as the town was declared dead on paper, something strange happened. A few residents refused to leave. They stayed behind in a place the government said should not exist. living among ruins and warning signs, insisting that Centralia was still their home. And that raises an unsettling question. When a town is declared uninhabitable, who decides when it truly stops being alive? Once the relocation program began, Centralia entered its most emotionally devastating phase. Not the fire, not the smoke, but the slow dismantling of a community forced to choose between survival and identity. Evacuation in Centralia was not a single moment. It was a long, grinding process that unfolded over years, tearing the town apart piece by piece. For residents, the choice was never simple. Accepting the buyout meant agreeing that your home was unsafe, that the place where you built your life was now officially a mistake. It meant packing decades of memories into boxes, knowing you would never return. Many families felt guilt for leaving others behind. Some felt shame, as if abandoning Centralia meant betraying their ancestors. Others felt relief mixed with grief, the emotional equivalent of escaping a burning house while watching it collapse behind you. Refusing the buyout carried its own cost. Those who stayed watched their neighborhoods disappear. Friends moved away. Houses were demolished or left to rot. Roads became empty corridors lined with weeds and cracked pavement. Mail delivery stopped. Trash pickup ended. Streetlights went dark. Staying meant isolation, not just physically, but socially. Centralia was no longer a town you lived in. It was a place you endured. Families fractured under the strain. Some couples disagreed violently about whether to leave. Parents argued over children's safety versus financial survival. Elderly residents often refused to move, while younger family members left, creating emotional distance that never healed. Holidays stopped being communal. Traditions dissolved. The shared future that once bound neighbors together evaporated. The landscape reflected this emotional collapse. Entire blocks were bulldozed, leaving only foundations like scars in the earth. Churches stood empty, then closed. The school, once filled with children, shut its doors. What remained felt unnatural, a town stripped of its purpose, existing only because a few people refused to let go. Centralia became a place of echoes. Smoke continued to rise from vents in the ground, drifting across empty streets. Warning signs appeared where homes once stood. Danger, carbon monoxide, replaced family names on mailboxes. The fire did not care who stayed or left. It burned steadily beneath it all, indifferent to human attachment. Those who remained often described a strange sense of defiance. They believed leaving would erase their story. They believed staying was an act of resistance, against bureaucracy, against fear, against being told their home was worthless. Some claimed the danger was exaggerated. Others acknowledged the risk, but accepted it as the price of belonging. But the longer they stayed, the more Centralia ceased to function as a community. There were no longer shared routines, no schools, no gatherings, no future planning. Only maintenance of the present. Only survival. Living in Centralia became a solitary experience, even when a few neighbors still lived nearby. And perhaps the cruelest part of all was this. The fire gave no clear deadline. There was no final explosion that forced everyone out at once. No moment of closure. Just an endless, low-burning threat that stretched the evacuation across decades, denying residents the clarity that disasters usually bring. Centralia didn't end in a single tragedy. It ended in slow motion. As the town emptied, outsiders began to arrive. Photographers, urban explorers, curiosity seekers drawn to the spectacle of abandonment. What had been a home became an object of fascination, a warning, a symbol. For those who lived there, this transformation was painful. Their loss had become someone else's intrigue. And with that shift, Centralia crossed another line, from living place to legend. Decades after the last families were forced to leave, Centralia did not become silent. It became something far stranger, a town without residents, but not without activity. Beneath the empty streets, the fire still burns, turning Centralia into a place suspended between past and future, neither alive nor truly dead. Today, only a handful of people remain, living among ruins under special legal allowances. They exist in a town stripped of official status, without a zip code, without municipal services, without recognition as a functioning community. Centralia exists on maps as a warning, not as a destination. And yet, the fire continues its work. The underground coal seams are still burning, spreading slowly, relentlessly. Scientists estimate the fire could continue for another 200 to 250 years if left unchecked. That means Centralia's danger will outlive everyone who remembers what the town once was. The disaster has transcended generations. Walking through Centralia now feels unnatural. Roads end abruptly where houses once stood. Sidewalks lead nowhere. Empty lots are marked only by vents releasing warm air and toxic gases into the sky. Smoke drifts lazily from cracks in the ground, sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, always present. In winter, snow melts in long, winding patterns that trace the hidden movement of the fire below. One of the most infamous remnants is the abandoned stretch of Route 61. Once a major highway, it was closed after subsidence and cracking made it unsafe. Over time, the road fractured completely, splitting into jagged slabs warped by heat and collapse. Nature began reclaiming it. Graffiti appeared. What was once infrastructure became a symbol, a scar left behind by industrial neglect and delayed accountability. This road, often called Graffiti Highway, drew thousands of visitors for years. People came to walk the broken asphalt, take photos, and stand above the fire. For outsiders, it was eerie, fascinating, even thrilling. For former residents, it was painful. Their hometown had become an attraction, its suffering reduced to visuals and curiosity. Authorities eventually covered the road with dirt to discourage trespassing, citing safety concerns. But even buried, the symbol remains. Centralia cannot be hidden easily. The fire ensures that. Environmental monitoring continues to this day. Gas levels are tracked. Ground temperatures are measured. Reports are filed. Yet these actions are no longer about saving a town. They are about containment, preventing the fire from spreading into nearby areas and affecting neighboring communities. Centralia's role has changed. It is now a case study taught to engineers, environmental scientists, urban planners, and policymakers. A lesson in how small decisions, when combined with delay and denial, can create disasters that outlast political terms, budgets, and lifetimes. But beyond the data and diagrams lies something harder to measure: the psychological weight of abandonment. Former residents speak of grief that never fully resolves. You don't mourn Centralia the way you mourn a person. There was no funeral, no final goodbye, just gradual erasure. Each demolished house felt like a memory being wiped clean. Some return occasionally, standing where their homes once stood, trying to locate rooms that no longer exist. Others refuse to come back at all. For them, Centralia is not a curiosity, it's an open wound. What makes Centralia uniquely disturbing is that it challenges a comforting belief that disasters eventually end, fires burn out, floods recede, earthquakes stop shaking. Centralia's disaster does none of those things. It burns, quietly, persistently, long after attention fades. It reminds us that some mistakes do not resolve within human timelines. Some consequences are simply inherited. As the fire continues beneath empty land, the question shifts again, away from Centralia itself and toward what it represents. What does it mean when a town disappears, but the danger remains? Before we continue, leave a comment. Do you think Centralia should be preserved as a warning, or sealed off completely and forgotten? Centralia is often described as a tragedy caused by fire, but that description is incomplete. The fire was only the mechanism. The true cause was something far more familiar: neglect layered on top of convenience, silence layered on top of uncertainty, and power choosing delay over disruption. Centralia did not vanish because no one knew. It vanished because knowing did not immediately force action. What makes Centralia uniquely disturbing is that nothing about this outcome was inevitable. At multiple points, the disaster could have been contained. Early on, aggressive excavation and isolation of the burning seams might have stopped the spread. Later, decisive evacuation could have prevented decades of slow suffering. Each option carried cost, political risk, and public backlash. And at every stage, delay felt easier than commitment. This is where Centralia stops being just a town and becomes a mirror. The story exposes a structural flaw in how societies handle slow-moving catastrophes, emergencies that explode demand response, emergencies that smolder, invite negotiation, budget committees, feasibility studies, and postponement. By the time action becomes unavoidable, the cost has multiplied beyond reason. Centralia shows what happens when responsibility is diffused. Local officials lacked funding. State agencies debated jurisdiction. Federal authorities hesitated to intervene fully. Each layer waited for another to act. In that vacuum, the fire kept burning. The ground kept collapsing. People kept living in danger long after experts understood the risks. There is also a deeper, uncomfortable truth. Centralia was a working-class town. Its residents did not have the political leverage of major cities or wealthy suburbs. Had this fire ignited beneath a financial district or a tourist hub, intervention would likely have been immediate and absolute. Instead, Centralia became a test case for how much risk society is willing to tolerate when the population affected has limited power. The legacy of Centralia is not just environmental, it is institutional. It raises questions that remain unresolved today. Who decides when a place is no longer worth saving? How long can governments ethically allow people to live in known danger? At what point does voluntary choice become abandonment disguised as freedom? Even now, similar coal fires burn around the world, in China, India, Australia, and parts of the United States. Some have burned for centuries. Centralia is not an anomaly. It is simply one of the few places where the consequences were visible enough to force evacuation. And yet, despite everything, Centralia endures as a warning precisely because it still burns. The fire beneath it is a physical reminder that certain decisions cannot be undone, that some mistakes do not fade when attention moves on, that land, once poisoned or destabilized, carries memory longer than people do. What remains of Centralia today is not a town, but a lesson written into the earth. A lesson about industry without foresight, about governance without urgency, about communities asked to bear risks they did not create, and about the cost of waiting too long to say, "This is no longer acceptable." The ground under Centralia will continue to burn long after this story is told, long after names fade from maps, long after debates end, and that may be the most unsettling truth of all. If you've stayed with this story until the very end, you've witnessed more than just a town lost to fire. You've seen a warning etched into the earth itself. Centralia's tragedy is a lesson about inaction, denial, and the consequences of ignoring the invisible threats beneath our feet. Now, it's your turn. Comment below with your theory or reflection on Centralia. Do you see it as a story of human error, institutional failure, or something even deeper? Sharing your thoughts helps others engage and think critically about these events. If this video gave you insight into the hidden dangers and lessons of abandoned towns, leave a like to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of mystery, history, and the consequences that echo across decades. And before you go, check out the next video appearing on your screen. It continues exploring the eerie stories of abandoned towns and the secrets they hold, revealing mysteries that will keep you questioning what really lies beneath.